Hey, hello Cloud Gurus, and welcome to this lecture. So in this lecture, we're going to go ahead and start getting our hands dirty with S3, past all the boring theory stuff. As always, the best way to learn something about AWS is to go ahead and get your hands dirty. So let's log into the AWS console. Okay, so here I am in the AWS console. Note up here, my region is Northern Virginia. If I go down to services, I'll be able to see S3, which is under storage. Go ahead and click on S3. Note that as soon as you do, your region has changed to global. So S3 is one of the few services that does not require a region selection. So whenever you're looking at S3, it's a global point of view. IAM, which we covered off 2 lectures ago, is similar. So is Route 53, which is Amazon's DNS service. But almost every other service is regional. So you have to select the region that you're in. Now, I don't have any buckets right now. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and create a bucket. So in here we type our bucket name. You see here it says enter DNS compliant bucket name. So your buckets are always a web address, and DNS compliance just means that it's a valid web address. So if you try and do an exclamation mark, for example, that's not a valid character in a web address. So I'm just going to write Ryan and Faye as my bucket name. In here we specify our region. We've got lots of different regions that we can deploy buckets into. Right now I'm just going to use US East 1, so North Virginia. And click in there. And in here you can copy settings from an existing bucket, but I have no existing bucket. So I'm going to go ahead and hit next. In here, this is where we can add things like versioning, server access logging, etc. We cover this in a lot more detail in the Certified Solutions Architect Associate course. So if you do want to learn more about S3, check that out. It's not really relevant for the Certified Cloud Practitioner. In here, we've got block public access. So this is basically ensuring that our buckets are always private. What you want to do is just uncheck this because we want to make objects within our bucket public. So make sure you uncheck that and go ahead and hit next. And in here, we just get a summary of our bucket. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create bucket. And we can see our bucket in here, and we can see our access objects can be public. You can go in and edit the public access settings, so you can block it if you want. I'm not going to do that because I want to be able to share my objects. So let's go into our bucket. Now our bucket is just, as I said in the last lecture, it's just a folder name. So it's just a name of a folder in the cloud that you can access. And in here, we've got our overview, we've got properties, permissions, and management. So the first thing we want to do is we want to upload a file to S3. So go ahead and hit the upload button and go and add files. I'm going to add 2 files. So there's one of me and my brother with Jeff Barr and one with me and Faye at Replay. And for those of you that don't know, Replay is the biggest tech party on the planet. It's the very last night of reInvent, and you will have famous DJs like Skrillex. There's free food and alcohol, and it just goes all night to about midnight or longer. So I would recommend, if you do go to reInvent in 2019, checking out Replay. It's the best party on the planet. I'm going to go ahead and hit upload. And in here, we can see my 2 different files. So Faye and Ryan at Replay, and then jeffbar.jpg. Now, if I was to click on this file and click on the link, we're going to get an error message. And you can see here it says, this XML file does not appear to have any style information associated with it. Error. And then the code is access denied, access denied. So this file is not public, and by default anything you put into S3 is not public. You have to actually jump through a whole bunch of hoops in order to make a file public. So I'm just going to go back to my Ryan and Faye bucket. Let's see how I can make this public. All I do is click in here and I go to actions, and then we're going to click make public, and then I'm going to go ahead and make that public. And then when I now click on this link, I should be able to view it. And there we go, there's me and Faye at Replay, and we're wearing a Cloud Guru t-shirts that were battery powered and they lit up. So we're getting approached by a lot of people. It was lots and lots of fun. Likewise, if I want to go back in and make a photo of me and my brother with Jeff Barr public, all we need to do is click on here. You could go to actions and go make public. You could also just click on the permissions over here, and then you just go to public everyone and click on there. And just go and change this read object, and it'll give you a big warning here. Go ahead and hit save. And then if we click on the file again, so click in here and click on this link over here, that will now make it public. So now I can view me and my brother with Jeff Barr, and that was at reInvent 2017. So we now know how to upload files to S3. Remember, every time you upload a file, you're going to get a HTTP 200 code that's going to be sent back to your browser. And what we can do now is we can go over to Properties and have a look. Versioning, like I said, we cover that off in Certified Solutions Architect Associate course. But in here, we can change the properties of our buckets. So we can add static website hosting, which is what we're going to do in the very next lecture. You can scroll down. We can do object locking. We can do tags on our objects. We can enable transfer acceleration. We can receive notifications when specific events occur in our bucket, such as uploading new objects. We can actually make somebody else pay for the objects in our bucket whenever they do a request. They need to have an AWS account. Again, it's completely beyond the scope of this course for that. In here, we've got our permissions. So this is where we can manage our public access settings, so whether or not people are able to view things in our bucket. In here, we've got our management, so we can do lifecycle management of our objects. So after they get older than 90 days, for example, we could archive them off to Glacier. In here, we've got replication, so we could go ahead and set up cross-region replication. So every time I upload my bucket to Northern Virginia, those files are going to be replicated over to Sydney. One of the most important things we can do, if we just go over to our individual files, we can go ahead and we can change the properties just by clicking on the properties in here. So I could go in and change for this individual file, I could change the storage class, for example. So here we've got standard, intelligent tiering, standard IA, one zone IA, Glacier. You will see here reduced redundancy, which I didn't include in the last lecture. This is being phased out, but this is basically one zone IA, more or less. One zone IA is actually cheaper, but they are eventually phasing out RRS, so you won't be asked any questions on that in the exam. It's just basically the same thing as one zone IA. So you can change your storage class on demand. It doesn't require any kind of reboot or anything like that. It will just happen instantaneously. So this is now one zone IA for the Faye Ryan replay object. Very last thing I want to show you before we go on to how to host static websites with S3. So we just go back to the Ryan and Faye bucket. In here, if we go down to properties and we go over to transfer acceleration, you can enable it if you want. If you want to actually click and compare how transfer acceleration is, how it's going to work for you, just go ahead and click on that link. That will then start uploading files to different regions around the world, and you'll be able to see the difference that transfer acceleration makes. Now, this is going to take about 5 or 10 minutes, so I'm just going to pause the video and wait for this to complete. Okay, so hopefully this is finished, and you can see, so I'm based in London right now. If I was uploading to Virginia, if I was doing it directly, this would be my upload speed, and this would be my transfer upload speed. So it is a lot faster. It's 84% faster. It should be faster pretty much anywhere you go. The further away, the better speeds you get. The only one where it's not happening to me is Dublin. It is actually faster for me to upload it directly over the internet right now. That really just depends on the time of day and network latency. And you'll only find it slower for regions that are closest to you. So Dublin and to London itself, it's slower. Everywhere else in the world, it's a lot faster. And like looking at Sydney, oh my God, 315% faster. Or going to Singapore, 627% faster than if I was doing it directly. So that is all S3 transfer acceleration is. Let's go on to my exam tips. So what are my exam tips? Well, as you know, bucket names share common namespace. So you cannot have the same bucket name as someone else. You cannot get Test Bucket or A Cloud Guru. So make sure you choose a name that's unique to you. When you view your buckets, you view them globally, but you can have buckets in individual regions. So we saw that we had a global view of S3, but when we actually create our buckets, they're created in individual regions. You can actually replicate the contents of one bucket to another bucket automatically using cross-region replication. So we have our bucket in Northern Virginia. We can actually replicate the contents of that bucket over to Sydney. You can change the storage class and encryption of your objects on the fly. And just remember the different storage classes. So we have S3 standard, S3 infrequently access, S3 one zone IA. We then have S3 intelligent tiering. We also did see in the lab that we had S3 RRS or reduced redundancy storage, but that is being phased out and you will not be tested on it, but just do be aware of it. We then have S3 Glacier and then S3 Glacier Deep Archive. So those are the 6 different storage classes available to your objects using S3. And then finally, we looked at transfer acceleration. So if we've got our users all around the world and they want to upload a large file to our bucket in London, what they can do is upload it to an edge location, and then those edge locations use the Amazon backbone networks to bring it into London, and it can be a hell of a lot quicker. It really just depends on network latency and where it is you're uploading your files to. And my final exam tip for S3 is how to restrict bucket access, or even how to control permissions on buckets. And there's 3 different ways to do this. The first is using a bucket policy, and this is going to apply across the entire bucket. And we're going to look at this in the very next lecture when we create a website on S3. The other way we can restrict bucket access or grant object access is using object policies. And rather than applying this across an entire bucket, these are actually applied to individual files within your bucket. And then finally, we can use IAM policies to users and groups within your AWS account to control bucket access. So maybe you want your HR department to be able to access the HR bucket, but you don't want the finance teams or the sales and marketing teams to be able to read those confidential informations. So you can use identity access management policies, applying them to individual users or to groups which contain individual users, and then they would be able to access that bucket or not, depending on the policies that you define. So please remember those 3 going into your exam. So that's it for this lecture, everyone. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture where we're going to create a website using S3.